so the final topic we're going to go through today then is just basic user role management. Now, right now, we're seeding a couple roles, a few users, and so on as we execute that initializer for our application DB context. At this point, we haven't restricted at all. A user can just come along to our site and register, right? Especially because we took away that requirement to have them confirm or validate their email address. So anybody can just come and register and create themselves as a new user, and that's okay, right? Oh, sorry, I thought I had that muted. Hang on. Okay. So what was I saying? Oh yeah, before I got interrupted by that silly notification. Basic user role management. So we have that much in place. A user can come and they can just register. But one thing that's missing, and you find that there's nothing in the built-in identity pages that do this for us, and that is assign users into roles, right? So I've come up with a little approach here. It's just very basic. We're going to be incorporating this into a much larger overall solution for managing. Okay, eventually you end up in most applications you're doing for a corporate client, right? You'll either have employees or staff, or there might be volunteers, whatever, and you need to manage them and manage them in a way that synchronizes with their ability to log in and what they can do in the system. So this will be just one part of a larger overall approach to employee management, so to speak. But we can just get this in place right now, and that way we can move people in and out of roles. Okay, we aren't going to create new roles. And, that's something you don't really usually do very often because remember, it's all in the annotations in the controllers. So if you just on the fly create a new role, well, if it's not mentioned in the annotations, it doesn't do you much good anyway, right? But we often need to, okay, change what users are in roles, and that is something that we need to be able to maintain all the time. So that's really the purpose of this little exercise here. So again, follow along with the copy paste file, and we'll get this in place. So I'll stop running. All righty. So uh, what are we going to do? Well, we already have our users, okay? So we're going to manage this pretty much in a similar approach how we've done other many-to-many relationships. Now, it is a many-to-many because, of course, we know a user can be in many roles, and a role can have many users, right? So just like we've done this, we've done it with checkboxes or with two list boxes where you move things back and forth. I'm just going to use checkboxes. We don't usually have very many roles. I think, 8 or 10 roles is the most in any real world application that I've ever done or had to work with, or got to work with, I should say. I had the privilege of working with. Anyone I've ever done in the real world has never had more than 10 roles in total. So, check boxes, I think, usually work fine. It's more typically a half dozen or less at most, right? Now, one thing I could reuse, remember we did earlier on, we made some nice view models and so on for working with check boxes, list boxes, things like that, right? So if I come to view models, okay, we'll already see some here, our check option, list option. Problem is, the way these are set up is they have integers, right? And we don't, okay? When it comes to the identity system, let me just bring up the tables here for a second. Now we actually have some data in them, right? Just make sure I refresh here. If I come down to the tables, okay, for example, here's our ASP.NET users. So if I do this so I can see the first few rows, here's my admin, my super, my user, and so on and so forth. Look at the IDs. Those aren't integers, right? They're GUIDs, global unique identifiers, big long strings that the system has created, right? And same thing, so here for roles, right? The IDs are all these GUIDs. So even here, user roles, well, that maintains, this is the associative or intersection entity that maintains the many-to-many between user and role, right? So not surprisingly, what do we see in here? All we see are the two primary keys, the primary key of the user, the primary key of the role, bada bing, bada boom, right? The two foreign keys making up a composite primary key, right? And that's exactly the kind of thing we've done before with our own many-to-manys that we've managed. But this time, of course, it's all these big long strings. So that's why, okay, long story short, but it's actually interesting to look at this. Notice what else you see in here. So you have the normalized email, normalized and so on. Email confirmed, it's a Boolean, so 0 is false. By the way, that's something I could have done as well, is in my seed data, I could have set just as we set username and email, I could have set email confirmed to true and then lied to the system and said, okay, no, we've already done that. But instead, I just turned off the requirement to have it confirmed. There's all the passwords. Oh, say security stamps and so on. Concurrency is, but there are things you can actually have a phone number in here. Anybody have a guess as to why we might want a phone number? Why the identity assumes that that might be important? Anybody? When you're logging into a system, sometimes a password isn't enough. Uh, yes, yeah, basically two-factor authentication, right? That's why we need a phone number so that we can actually do that. Two-factor enabled, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, anyway, enough about that. Let's get back to actually managing users in roles, right? So I can close all these. I'm done with them for now. So I was talking about those view models and why they just don't work very well for us. Now I could mess around with them, but you know what? Sometimes making a clean, separate separation of concerns is more important than minimizing the amount of code you write. So I'm just going to make my new classes. They're very much the same as the ones we've done before, right? So here's my user view model. And while I'm here, I might as well make the other one that I'm going to need, my role view model. And although they're quite similar to what we've done in the past, the main difference is that the ID, okay, matches, of course, the type of data we store for the IDs for users and roles in the identity system. It has to be a string, right? So my user just has the primary key, the string, the ID, the username, and then a list of strings, the user roles, right? So of course, that's not how it's stored in the database. That's for our convenience for displaying it on the screen. And notice I'm even using display name annotations here, right? So that when I actually show user view model objects on the screen in my UI, I can use these display names. Don't need them in here because this is just used internally to manage, right? This is like my checkbox, okay? This will give me my each checkbox that I'm going to show on the UI here. Again, the role ID though is that big long string, that GUID, right? The name of the role and true or false. Okay, are they in the role? Are they assigned to that role, right? So very much a parallel to what we've done with many-to-many using checkboxes before. The main difference is we have strings instead of integers for our IDs. Okay, now we're going to make a controller to actually manage this, of course, right? I'm going to call it my, I'll start with an empty one as well, by the way. I know it's tempting. I could actually, because I have a view model, I could try to go through and scaffold it, but it'll be more trouble than not with all the build errors and things that it'll do. So it's easier to start with empty and add what I know I actually need, right? So it's going to be my user role controller, okay? User role. Yeah, that's it. All right. And one of the first things you want to think about is every time you add a controller or change things in a controller, who should be able to get here? Obviously, this is the kind of thing at this point I'll just say, well, I only have admin and supervisor. So yeah, it would be an admin user. It's their role to maintain who is in what role, right? That makes sense. And of course, I also want it to inherit from cognizant controller because why not? Okay, it'll make my life easier down the road. Okay. Now, I will need a couple of things. Now, we're used to this, right? In our constructor for controllers, usually we inject, okay, from the services available in Program CS, we inject our DB context. The interesting thing in this particular controller is our DB context is not our usual one. It's the one for the identity system, our application DB context, right? But that's not all. Let me just point out before I go on and copy paste into here. If I come to data, have a look at our application DB initializer. Remember, we had these two things that we use. We use a role manager, right? But we don't need to create roles, so we won't need one of those. But we will need a user manager. Our user manager makes it much easier for us to do things like add users to roles and remove them from roles and so on and so forth. So that's the other thing we're going to make use of, right? So let me come down here, add the constructor, okay? But notice the two things we're pulling in is an application DB context and our user manager, right? And those are the tools that we need to add to our toolkit here to be able to do the work we need to do this basic user role management. Okay, All right. Now for the rest of this, I might as well just get my code and we'll walk through it. Click, 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 click on the keyboard, making sure I select the right amount of code. Not too much, not too little. Okay. And I'll just do a build to see if I have one X. Yep. Okay. Yeah, I did. I have one too many curly braces. Okay. Oh, all right. Yeah. That's just I'm missing a using. Okay. Because I started with an empty controller, it didn't have the using for Entity Framework Core. Okay, there we go. That's fixed as well. All right, good. Okay, so let's just talk about what we've added here. So first of all, we'll start with the index action, right? Because we do need to get up a list to see, okay, what users do we have and what roles are they in, right? So how does this work? Well, again, we're asynchronous task, action result, index. Okay. So first of all, we're going to go, our context, remember, is our application DB context, but it is still a DB context, still a connection to all the DB sets, okay? Basically the ones that we saw there in the represented by each table in our database, ASP.NET users, et cetera, right? So I can just go to the users DB context. I can even order it, okay, by the username, which is of course really an email address, but that's okay. So that'll get the data from the actual database tables themselves, the ones we were looking at a few minutes ago. But I'm going to select into a new user view model because that view model was designed specifically for showing the necessary information on the screen, right? So as I do this, I'm really just pulling the ID, that GUID, and the username, which of course we know really is an email address, right? So that's all I'm pulling from it initially because remember the actual roles are across that many-to-many relationship. So rather than worrying about trying to do includes and so on and so forth, right? It's easier to just call upon my user manager. So I get my basic list of user view model objects, which I'm calling users, and then I just loop through them and ask my user manager to use its superpowers, right? So unit manager, unit. Done too much unit testing lately. User manager, find by ID. So we have the ID. We know that GUID, the unique identifier of the user, right? That gets us our, notice, identity user, not my own view model. This is the actual one in the identity system, right? And then with that, I can call user manager and ask it to do this. Get roles async, pass the identity user, and look what it returns. It returns a I list of strings, the names of all the roles the user's in. Well, that's exactly what I want to store. The only thing is it's an I list. So that's why I have the cast here to actually convert it to a list because that is the property I created, right, in my own user view model, right, is a list of strings. And there we go. But now each and every one of these user view model objects has that list of strings contained in it, all the names of all the roles that they're in. Okay, and then we can return view, passing that collection, that list of my view model objects. So let's make the view next. So we just right click, add view. Now, once more, I could be tempted to try and use the model, but I won't. Okay, so I'll just leave it as empty. And I'll just take a moment to cook that. And to create a view like this, well, we've got enough index views around our application now. We know the basic structure, what to put in here. So it's really not a big deal, right? So I'm just going to throw my code in, okay? I'm not using my heading because I don't really want it to just say user role index. I like to say user role assignments, okay? But here's my table, right? I just have two columns. And because I did add those display name properties, those annotations, I should say, on the properties in my view model object, okay, then I can use display name for username and roles, right? Then my for each loop just goes through each one of my users, okay, in the system here, and I'll show the actual username. And rather than worrying about, I mean, there's only a few roles, right? So rather than worrying about bootstrap collapse or anything. I'll just basically put a BR tag after the name of each role, and that's that. Okay. Notice I'm using my new style of edit button. Okay, link that looks like a little button, right? And away we go. Okay, so that's good for my index. All right, let's get back to the controller. Any questions about the index? Okay. Now, we don't create users, at least not at this point, right? They come and they register and then they're in the system. That's how it will work right now. All we're doing is moving them in and out of roles. So we don't need any create, okay? And there's no need for any details either. All we really do is we edit. And we aren't actually editing the user. We're just editing what roles they're in, right? But of course, like any CRUD operation, we have a two-pronged approach. We have a get, okay, that gets the data for the screen, and then the post is where we actually make any changes. So not surprisingly, our get for edit then, okay, we make sure we actually have an ID, right? Of course, it's a string. All of our primary keys are strings here working with identity, right? And then we just ask our user manager to once more go and get the identity user, right? And then as long as we actually have it, okay, then I'll build my own user view model object, okay, pulling information from the identity user. And right now it has everything I need, okay, so I can get the ID, I can get the name, and I can have my user manager help out getting all the roles and doing the same kind of code I did earlier, right? That gives me all the user roles for my user view model. Now, of course, I only have one here because we're editing, so I don't have a whole list of them, I just have the one, right? Then I'm going to call populate. Okay. Now this is similar, again, a parallel to what we did earlier on with our checkboxes. Right. We'll go look at that in a minute. Okay. Just we'll finish our discussion here of the edit get. So we pass the user, and that'll just prepare, as we know, in view data information to build all the appropriate checkboxes and which ones should already be checked and which ones shouldn't be checked. Right. And that's passed in view data to the view itself. So let's make the view. Right click. We'll add that view. Again, raise your view. Okay, it's just called edit, but an empty view is good. And while that cooks, all right. So I'm ready to go. I'll just take that out and put my code in. Again, this is very much like other edit views we've done, so you can look at any of them, get inspiration, figure out what code you want, right? I have a form, action is edit. That's all I really need. Okay, I have my validation summary at the top. Notice I do need a hidden input. Okay, that's something you'll find in all of our edit views, right? A hidden input for the primary key. So that's for our ID, right? That's how we tuck it away inside just to make sure. Now, it is actually uh, uh, key to have that there. We can't actually function without it. Then I'm still using an input. This, instead of just putting in a label this time, I thought I'll leave it in an input, but I'll add this, read only, right? That way I think it looks more natural. It looks like, hey, that's the spot where you would enter in the username, but we're reminding the student visually, the user visually, that of course they can't actually change this because it's marked as read only, and they'll see that it's grayed out and they cannot change it, right? But that way we actually have it. Come to think of it, I don't really need this span, do I? Oh well. No harm in it really being there. I could take it out because you're not actually validating this. Well, maybe I will, just to prove that I am right. Okay, that we don't actually need it. It's still in my copy paste file, so feel free to take it out if you feel inspired to do so. Okay, then, okay, I'll have my next form group, okay, where I have my user roles, okay, label, and that will again use the display name for it, right? And away we go. So I just have my typical loop, okay, to create all of the going to my roles that I add it in the controller. I know we didn't look at the code, but it's very much like the same as our other checkbox approach. So I get my whole list of role view model objects, basically one representing each checkbox, go through, show the checkbox with the role name beside it, checked will be checked if it was assigned, and so on and so forth. And that's it. Then we have our submit button at the end. Okay, notice I can use my back to list partial, right? That works fine because I'm using a cognizant controller for the actual user role controller. Okay, so coming back to the controller again, right? Look at edit post. So what we're going to do is we're going to get the primary key sent back in. We're going to get the selected roles, right? So we go and we get once more the identity user, okay, with our user manager, right? We build our own user, okay, our user view model object with the ID, the username, and the roles. And then, okay, because remember, all we're doing is we're not actually even changing the user. We're calling update user roles, okay, just like we do with other checkboxes. We pass in what the data was given to us in our action here from the checkboxes that were checked, right? That comes in as selected roles, and of course the user view model object itself. And then once we've done doing all our updates for what roles they're in, we just go back to the index action. Our catch, the exception in here is very general. Hey, unable to save changes. Never actually seen this happen. Don't know why it ever would, but good practice. Have a catch there and at least give some feedback to the user. And if we did have to return to the edit view once more, we have to make sure we repopulate, okay, the assigned role data once more. Okay, so that finishes the whole edit process. There's no delete, there's no details, there's no create, just edit, right? But we do have these two methods to actually prepare the checkboxes for display and of course do the actual updates when the data comes back in the post. So populate assigned role data, okay? This is the kind of code we did with checkboxes before. We have our user view model object that comes in, right? So I go to the database and it is again our application DB context, but the roles will just return all the roles, okay? So each one is an identity role, right? Current roles, these are the ones the user has. So this is my list of strings, okay? And then I create a role, an empty list of role view model objects, right? And away we go. So I just do a for each through all the roles there are. And for each one then, okay, I add a role view model here, pulling the ID, the name, and assigned will be whether the current roles, right, contains, which I got up here. Those are the ones that the user has in that uh, uh, list of strings. If it contains the name of this particular role, as we consider each one in the database system, right, then we decide if it's assigned or not, okay? And that just prepares the checkboxes for display, adding it to the view bag here as simply roles, which is what we saw it was pulled out of right here, viewbag.roles. Okay, now the more interesting one, of course, is when we actually update user roles, right? So we pass in our string array of selected roles that comes from whatever checkboxes were actually checked. If none of them were checked, it'll be empty. And our user to update, our user view model. So we pass that from the edit post. So again, we go with our user update, grab that collection, that list of strings of all the user roles, right? And then we go to the user manager, okay, find the actual identity user as they're stored in the database right now. Now, if there are no checkboxes checked, so selected roles is null, okay, then we have no roles. So we just want to go and remove any that are currently assigned. So we just go through all the user roles and remove them, okay, and that's it. Then they're out of all the roles. Else, then now we have to worry about, okay, there's at least one checkbox checked. So is this a new one? Is this an old one? Is this a different one, right? So we have to deal with all those issues, okay? So it's just a matter of doing the loop in the loop approach here, right? But a bit of a note here. I'm going to stop and talk about this a little bit. Obviously, we want to loop through all the roles, okay? And we can get that from context.roles, okay? But if I just threw that in and just use it right here in the for each loop, I would eventually get an error message, right? There's an issue when you're pulling data asynchronously from a database. If you want to then use that data and loop through it, it might not be finished. Okay, you put it in the oven. Okay, and you walk away. You're doing something else. You come back and you pull it out to start working with it. Well, it might not have been cooked yet. Right? It's kind of the same idea. For safety, okay, you can't loop over a collection that's making asynchronous calls. Okay, unless you're going to be willing to live with an error like this. So this one line of code takes care of that. What I do is I execute this query first, and when it's finished, when we have all of our identity roles, okay, in this I list, right? Then I can actually go ahead and loop through it, right? So, just as an extra step that we have to do because we're working with an asynchronous situation. Okay, but now I have all the roles as they're defined in the database itself, okay, in the system. So I just go now for each one, I check, hey, was there a checkbox for that? The selected role that contains the name of this role? If it does, then I check, ooh, well, does the user have it? And if they don't, if it's not true that the user roles contains that role, then I'll call my user manager to add this user to that role, right? The else branch up here, okay, remember that the selected roles contains it, so it doesn't, so it's not checked. Well, but maybe it used to be. Maybe the user's unchecked it. So we have to see if user roles contains it, and if it does, then we actually just remove it. And by the time we've looped through all the roles, we have either added or removed as required. And that's basically it. I have this dispose down here just because we're making these extra little, the user manager and our contacts. So I'm just guaranteeing that they get disposed as the controller is disposed as well. All right. Any questions about that? Okay. Last thing I'm going to need is, of course, a navigation link in my menu system. So when we come down to view, shared, layout, right? So for this is kind of getting long. I should probably start breaking this up into multiple menus, but for now, I'm just going to add one more. I'm going to throw a divider in, right? So I have my little divider. Oh, I guess I have a little more white space than I needed. And then I'll have a link here. So the controller is my user role. My user role control, and the action is just simply index. Okay. Uh, Manage, maintain, I don't know. That should do the job. Okay, now remember, of course, if I'm not admin, I won't be able to go here. So I'll just double check that while we run it and test it. So if I log in as anything but admin, even supervisor, right? If I try to come down to maintain user roles, access denied. Okay, so I have to log in as administrator to test this at all. And now I should be able to come here. And there we go. Exactly what I wanted to see, right? These are all the users in the system, admin, super, and user. Those are the ones we seeded. I'm seeing what roles they're in. Now, if I come in here and change this, okay, I can check off both of these, save that. Notice that it's showing it as an input, but it's locked, right? Okay, and I see them there. So yeah, oh, no, I probably don't want them in either one, so I can take them out one at a time, take them out both together. Doesn't matter. Yeah, fully functioning. Now, let me just point out one last thing before we stop recording here. I mentioned that, yeah, I can just register, right? So I'll use my college email here, PA55W at RD, PA55W at RD. Uh, you'd think I could do this. Okay. So now, of course, mind you, I can't get here. But when we log out and log back in once more as admin, and there we go. So here's the new user. Okay, not in any role, because initially a user can be created, but they aren't in any role. By the way, just to point out, if I click the actual username here, have you done this before? There's all kinds of stuff here, right? You might say, well, where are all these views? Identity, account, manage, and there's email, password, so you can change your password, set up two-factor authentication, and so on. Personal data. Ooh, do you want to actually make sure all your personal data is deleted out of the system? All these options are there. You see all these pages being referenced. Look in your Solution Explorer, you won't see them, right? We're going to, next lesson, or actually next week, we'll talk about how we actually can access all of these that are currently right now in a compiled Razor library. All right, but just pointing out if you hadn't noticed before that all of this is by default here. Now, eventually you often will end up taking some of these capabilities away. Pretty much always you can allow people to change their password, right? Anytime they want, they should be able to change their password. Are you going to let them change email? Sometimes yes, maybe no, right? Send verification emails and so on, right? Anyway, enter their phone numbers, things like that. But now that I'm in as admin, right, I can fully come in, maintain user roles, and that was our goal for this lesson. Any questions about it? Okay. Alrighty. Well, that took a little longer than I thought, but that's okay. I think it's something we haven't done before, playing around with this, so it was worthwhile taking our time and talking about it as we went through. So I'm going to stop the recording.